But we have to understand that we're not getting out of Afghanistan anytime soon. Why? Because we have got air bases over there that are strategic to being able to handle and put the Chinese under the oppression of our government. You see, we have a global elite. This country has fallen, and we are actually in a very precarious situation. You'd be a lot safer in Russia because their government has not been taken over. Our government has. So we need to be prepared for being a wilderness generation. And if we're going to be a wilderness generation, we do need to start to plan for provision for our families and extricate ourselves from the cities, or at least make preparation for a place for our families to go if you do live in the cities. You need to start thinking about those things very seriously, because you do not want to get locked down in the FEMA system of the cities. That's where they're going to start to close everything down first. But we've got to learn from the previous wilderness generation. Turn with me to Bamidbar, Numbers chapter 14, verse 20. And Yahweh said, I have pardoned according to your word. But as truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the Tiferet, the glory, the beauty of Yahweh. Because all those men who have seen my Tiferet, my beauty, and my Nissim, signs and miracles, which I did in Mitzrayim and in the wilderness, they have tested me these 10 times, and they have not listened to my voice. You can see how this ties in with listening today to his voice. Now we're going to come across 10 tests. Now the first 5 tests have to do with the sin of unbelief. And that's the first stumbling block. People simply don't believe. They simply do not believe. They have a lack of faith. They have a lack of faith. The first 5 tests have to do with unbelief. But the last 5 tests, they have to do with the sin of not trusting Yahweh, which reveals their absolute rejection of Yahweh. So the first 5 tests, unbelief. The second 5 tests, you rejected the living Creator, the King of the universe. Let's look at these tests. Exodus chapter 14, Shemot 14, verse 11. The first test, a test of unbelief. It comes to us from Exodus chapter 14, verse 11 through verse 14. Go into the house of an Israelite, and what? You'll be saved. Go into the house of an Israelite, and you'll be saved. Leave the world. Go to the mountain and receive the commandments of Yahweh. The Israelites said, well, this is a mistake. Let's go back to Egypt. How many people, when it gets hard, are going to go, well, you know what? Those FEMA camps, they've got vaccinations, they've got food, they've got medicine, they've got blankets. You see, we're living on a reservation. And what did they do to the Native Americans, the First Nations people? Put diseases in the blankets, poison the food, and kill them off. Georgia Guidestones. You see, it's a big prison system. It's a big prison system. In fact, we just heard of somebody who's in prison, and another fellow inmate in prison was working in the kitchens. And he said, brother, all of the hamburger came in, and it was packaged, and I'm unpacking it, and it says, not for human consumption. You see, whatever they did to the First Nations people, that's what they're doing to the prisoners in this country, because that's where the model comes from. And what did they do? They would have the spoiled rations Sometimes from the Civil War, left over from the Civil War, the spoiled food rations that wasn't even fit for the soldiers, the blue coats, and they would feed them to the First Nations people who they got to covenant and give up land, give up rights so they could put them in the prison system. Now that reservation system has been expanded and we're in fact all living under it. And that's what we don't realize. Because we were supposed to come over here, when I say we, I say Europeans, were supposed to come over here and give the greatest gift to the First Nations people. And in return, we were supposed to receive a great gift from the First Nations people. That was the Creator's divine plan, His perfect will. But now we're in His permissive will. His perfect will was you go over and you give the greatest gift of my Son, and in return, you will receive the gift of land stewardship, animal husbandry, and how to truly love your neighbor. But we saw the mountains of gold, and we saw the land, and we coveted, we became greedy, and we enslaved the people. And now we are all living on the reservation. We're all living on the reservation. We're all in prison. And you don't think that those blankets are going to get infected that FEMA are pulling out and providing? You don't think everything that happened to the Cherokee, to the Sioux, to the Lakota, that is what will happen if you and I don't leave the wilderness and get this right. So the first test is one of unbelief. Don't go back to Egypt. When we leave the New World Order system, there will be people in our camp that will say, we should go back. We should go back. Because your belief will be tested. Their unbelief was that they didn't believe Yahweh would save them from the anti-Messiah or Pharaoh in their day. Yahweh will defeat Pharaoh's end-time anti-Messiah army. We have to trust in the provision of Yahweh. That's the first test. The second test comes to us from Shemo, Exodus chapter 15, verse 22 through 26. And it's the second test is unbelief again. The Israelites, they didn't believe Yahweh would provide the key essentials of life. After going 3 days without food and water, they found what? That the water was bitter. The water was bitter. And we're going to be faced with what? The same thing. Within 3 days, the shipping trucks will be stopped. Your grocery stores will be emptied, and you don't want to go there because you will get caught up in a riot, in a mob. And the Torah says, I believe it's Exodus 21, it could be Exodus 23, that we have no part in mob riots. We can't be a part of that. That's not biblical. You don't get caught up in that Tea Party stuff because you will get rounded up. You're supposed to be the gray man. You're supposed to be invisible. You don't get caught up in mob rule and mob judgment, because then you'll get caught up with that, you'll be all rounded up. You see, you need to understand now, you need to start getting your body temple clean and pure. Because if you're all jacked up on pharmakia, when that stops, you'll be crippled on the floor crying like a baby. I like coffee, I must tell you. I do. I like espresso. I try to get 3 or 4 shots a day. I truly do. But I have to go decaf some days, and sometimes I have to not do it for a while. Because have you ever tried fasting, like abstaining from any fluids and any food when you've had coffee the day before? It will send you to your knees. You'll be crying like a baby. But if you've got all the caffeine out of your system, you can go into a fast for days. You're fine. So think about the pharmakia. Think about all the stuff they've got us all hopped up on and addicted to. The moment that food stops, your body needs to be able to continue on. Otherwise, you'll be crying that you'll want to go back to Egypt. So now is the time to start testing yourself and preparing yourself so that you can. Now, I'm not recommending that you go against your physician's orders. Of course, I have to put that clause in there. Otherwise, people will be emailing, my wife died when you do your teaching. It's your fault. We're going to be faced with food and water shortages in some. Physical healing is needed for us to receive Yahweh's true teachings. And we have to believe in Yahweh for the essentials of life, not the New World Order. We have to believe in Him, truly, for the essentials of life. That was the second test. The third test, again, unbelief, comes to us from Exodus chapter 16, verse 1 through 8. Your murmurings are not against us, but they are, in fact, against Yahweh. In this test, we see the complaints were against leadership by the children of Israel. The Israelites, they were hungry. They didn't believe Yahweh would provide food for them in the wilderness. 1 month, they were only 1 month out of Egypt, and they were complaining. And there will be those among us in the last days who'll complain, oh, well, the light yoke of Torah, it's just too hard. We never had to put up with this kind of leadership in the church. We could do what we wanted as long as we paid our tithe and sung the right songs and stood when they said stand and sit when they said sit. This Torah yoke is way too hard. That was the third test. They'll lust after the flesh of Egypt. There'll be Israelites in the camp that will want to return to their jobs. They'll want to return to the subdivisions, and ultimately they'll only find FEMA camps or storage lockers. How many of you have driven past storage lockers? This is something that I always do whenever I see fencing and barbed wire. You'll be amazed when you see these big, they can often be state or federal compounds for cars, for vehicles. And the barbed wire is facing, which way is it? Yeah. It's facing in. And you're like, well, hang on a minute. If it was trying to keep the people out, it's actually designed because they're going to use them to keep the people in. I've had people actually come and speak to me and personally about storage locker units, and there's plumbing. Why is there plumbing? You're storing your trash. And then why is the fencing pointed in? You look at these places. It's amazing. Especially some of the places where they store the state vehicles. Huge, big lots. And it's to keep people in. Very quickly, they can turn these places into house people. And you see, this is what people will find. Take a close look at the test in verse 4 or 5 of Exodus chapter 16. Yahweh set up a way of gathering that I may test them, whether they will walk in my Torah or not. And that's it. We are tested to see if we'll walk in His Torah or not. The fourth test comes to us from Shemo, Exodus chapter 16, verse 20 through 28. And Exodus 17, verse 17. They didn't believe Moshe, that is the Torah that he had taught them. They gathered more than instructed during the week. It bred worms, and it stank. The people would not heed Moses. They didn't believe in the Shabbat. They didn't believe on taking that time. And in verse 24 it says, neither was there any worm inside. You see, there's no worm inside when you guard the commandments of Yahweh. It's true purity at its very, very core. Because the Catholic Church, you see, the Catholic Church, we can understand this from history. Council of Nicaea. They moved the Sabbath to another day, and by doing it, what does it do? It breeds worms and stinks. It breeds worms and stinks to Yahweh. Shabbat is the definition of your love to Yahweh and the sign to you that He's actually with you. It's an oath. It's a sign. They had to decide whether to gather or to stay in their tents, congregate together and obey. Some Israelites didn't believe Yahweh, and they gathered on the seventh day. It wasn't because they needed to. It wasn't because they had a need, but because of unbelief in Yahweh, unbelief in his provision. Shabbat is the first test of obedience for many of us, and it sets us apart from the world to trust Yahweh in his provision. Many of you know that since I was 17 years old, I've been a hairdresser and a barber. When I came into the Sabbath, I'm self-employed. I'm going to have to close my business down the day that I make triple the income on the Sabbath? Well, do you believe or not? So I shut my business down. Do you know what you're insane. Well, the funny thing is, you have to take the step. Come and you will see. Don't think, because you'll think yourself into a corner. Come and then you will see. There's this funny thing in the world of hairdressing and barbering, and that's that hair designers they close their salons on Mondays. On Saturdays, I always had short timers anyway. I only ever wanted to work to 4 o'clock because, you know, I had short timers anyway. So I open up my shop 8:30 Monday morning. I close my shop 8:30 Monday night. I made more money on Mondays than I ever did on the Sabbath. But I had to come and see before I knew. And I have other brethren that are also in the same business of and they have the same testimony. Mario, if you're watching, Tamara, if you're watching. Because what a blessing. What a blessing. But we have to come and see. You see? Isn't that fabulous? It's truly, you have to walk it out. You have to walk it out. And once you do, you'll never go back. You'll never go back. I've now got like 40 people and a bunch of staff. And do you know how many times they come to me? Oh, we really should open on Saturday. I say, look, if you want to open on Sunday, we can do that. Well, no, we don't want to do it. Why not? Well, we really should decorate. I say, well, if you want to decorate, we can decorate. We'll put a whopping big golden menorah. That's how we'll decorate. Otherwise, no decorations for you today. But I have to have these fights all the time with these Hallmark holidays that come up. It's crazy. But Shabbat truly is the definition of us walking with Yahweh. Some Israelites, they didn't believe Yahweh, and they gathered on the seventh day. And again, it wasn't because of need. It was because of a lack of faith in Yahweh to provide. Shabbat is the very first test for many of us of obedience to Yahweh, and it sets us apart from the world. We look strange, and people wonder, well, why aren't you doing that? And you have a testimony. They were told to gather manna early in the morning, and I admonish you all. Get in the Word and get in prayer first thing in the morning before the sun hits you and you start to stink. Seriously. Because when you go to work, when you're out in the world, stuff happens and it hits you. But if you've had time in the Word in the morning and in prayer, then you go out and it hits you, you've got the Word in you to respond. But the days that you're late, like I was the other day, and I forgot to set my alarm, or I think I set it to PM instead of AM, and I ran out of the house without being in the Word, and you get slammed. So get in the Word before it breeds. The day breeds worms and stinks on you. That's your defense. Get the word and get prayer in you each and every day, first thing in the morning. They're told to gather early in the morning before the cares of the world take us away. Let's look at the fifth test of unbelief. It comes to us from Exodus chapter 32, verse 1 through 8. They didn't believe in the fifth test of unbelief. They did not believe in the one true Elohim. The Israelites wanted an Elohim that they could command at the golden calf, did they not? They wanted an Elohim that they could command, not one according to the teachings and instructions of Moshe. No counterfeit will do in our walk. Believing in the one true Elohim, don't create other ways to worship him. Worship the way he wants to be worshipped. That's truly what he wants. Doesn't matter, well, in my heart I'm doing it. Yeah, I'm not worshiping your heart. I'm worshiping the one true Elohim, and I don't care what's going on in your heart, because your heart, like mine, is deceitfully wicked above all things. Who can know it? Repent and serve the one true living Elohim. Worship him the way he has laid out that he wants to be worshipped. Otherwise, Amos 5, your prayers and your festivities will be what? They will not be pleasing before the Creator. Now we've looked at the first 5 tests. We cannot fall prey to these tests of unbelief, because the next thing it leads you to is rejecting the one true living Elohim. Now we're going to look at the last 5 tests which deal with rejection. The 6th test comes to us from Numbers chapter 11, verse 1 through 10. They reject Yahweh. This is called the graves of the lust. It's known as the graves of the lust. If you look at verse 34, the Israelites rejected the manna. There is nothing at all beside this manna. What? What do you mean there is nothing at all beside this man? He just parted the Red Sea. There is nothing at all beside this manna. They rejected the presence of Yahweh in their very midst. In their very midst. Don't sit on the outside of the edges. There are always those that sit on the outside looking in. Get inside, get involved, get in the community of faith. It was always those that were trying to entrap Mashiach that sat on the outside edges. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, and whatnot. And the same with the camp of Israel. They rejected his presence. They rejected, what? There's nothing but this manna? Oh, well, except, last night there was this pillar of fire, and this morning there was a pillar of cloud. I mean, really? But they don't even see that. Because all they see is what is right in front of them. And that is what we are like today, isn't it? And they walk through traffic. How many times do you see that? I see it every day downtown. There goes another one, boom. I mean, how many times? Walking around, yeah, good to see you. Yeah, good, all right. It's crazy. If aliens could see us, which they can. I think that's in Torah Parsha Noah, if you want to know about that. Oh, yeah. That's a good one for late at night if you can't sleep. 7th edition Noah. But seriously, they did not see the very presence of Yahweh in their midst. They rejected his provision. The people rejected the manna, and in so doing, they rejected Yahweh. The 7th test comes from Numbers 11, verse 16 through 20, a test of rejection. The Israelites rejected Yahweh because you have despised Yahweh who is among you. Crying, they said, why did we leave Egypt? In verse 22, they remembered the meat. They remembered the meat of Egypt. They desired to return to the world for it. They wanted meat. And Yahweh gave them meat, did he not? Oh yeah, you want it? You want that? He'll put so much in it that it'll choke you until it comes out of your nostrils. Oh, you want carnality? Oh, you want debauchery? You want that? He'll give you right over to it. He'll give you right over to it. You'll end up overdosed and dead. You can't say that. Yes, I can. I have seen it. Do you know how many people, I have had friends who've blown their brains out. I have had people that have hung themselves and strung themselves up. I have seen a lot in my life, and I saw one friend of mine before he blew his brains out. He had pictures that he drew because he was seeing all of these demons, now I know, that were coming for him because he was so into the debauchery. And another friend of mine drew what he saw, and then the next day he's spread-eagled on the bed with a blood angel. So he didn't even have the sense to shoot himself with the right caliber. Shot himself in the head with a .22. That's a painful way to go. Bit too much information. But you know, what a crazy world. I've seen people be given over to it. And there's a serious, serious warning, stern warning. That's why we have got to flee. We have got to flee from iniquity. Because if you keep messing around with it, he will literally give you over. And we know that sin leads to death. Leads to death. So now we find that seventh test I said was Numbers chapter 11, verse 16 through 20. And again, they rejected his presence among them for the things of the world. That was really what it was. They didn't believe in his word. And we can't reject the presence of Yahweh among us. We can't. The eighth test, rejection, Numbers 11, verse 20 through verse 22. The Israelites rejected his salvation, verse 20. They asked, why did we come out of Egypt? Be warned, truly, be warned. Don't get caught up in all of this DNA testing that you see many messianics get caught up with. Genealogy tracing, trying to become Jewish, and lusting after being Jewish is not the way to walk. Remember, you can't be more Jewish than the Jews, who in fact really are Khazars, Ashkenazis, and it goes down that rabbit trail. It's crazy, isn't it? Because if you see, Ashkenaz was actually a son of what? Japheth. Whereas Ashkenazi was not a son of Shem, Shemitic. It's really crazy, because what we have to realize, quickly touching on this again, is that we have the pyramid with the all-seeing eye. We have the Washington, D.C., which is the military-industrial complex. Then we have the Bank of England, which is the financial end. And now we actually have the Jesuits back again in Rome. There's your pyramid. And then you have the Zionists, the all-seeing eye, and they really are funding all of this that's going on in Syria right now. They're funding. I mean, people are like, oh, no, Israel would never fund ISIS. Where are you? Oh, okay, you're evangelical, believing that 1948 was a miracle from the Father. No, it was a plan hatched by Theodore Herzl, for crying out loud, who hated the Creator, hated the Son. It's got nothing to do with biblical Israel. It's the return of all 12 tribes, all 12 and the sojourner. So what you should expect is for a wiping out of the western seaboard, where 2/5? Somebody help me out. Huh? Is it 2/5? Huh? 2/3? Excuse me, yes. 2/3 is going to be wiped out. That's what you'll see in the future to make room for the border expansion for true biblical Israel. See, everything that's black is really white. Everything that's up is really down. It's crazy, isn't it? But what this brings me to is this eighth test. Why did we come out of Egypt? We have to be realizing today that we need to be patient when our redemption draws nigh. There's room enough for everyone in the two houses of Israel. Take a good look at what we read earlier in Ephesians. We're all in the commonwealth of Israel. Don't draw back. Don't draw back. There's room for everyone under Messiah. Now the ninth test, rejection, Numbers chapter 12, verse 1 through 10. Now the sages teach that Moses abstained from sexual relationships with the Ethiopian woman. Now abstaining wasn't a requirement, but by choosing to abstain, Moshe was always ready to meet with Yahweh face to face, because he didn't require what? He didn't require mikveh before entering the tabernacle. So many of you would read that in Numbers chapter 12 and you'll go, well, what? This dissension with Miriam and Aaron, it was because of the Ethiopian woman? That makes no sense to me. But when you start to look at it, you go, well, hang on a minute. If Moshe was abstaining from marital relations so that he wouldn't have to take a mikveh, he would be immediately ready in a kadosh state to enter in and be panaim al panaim with Yahweh, face to face with Yahweh. That's why over the centuries many people have come to understand that this was really about Moshe being anointed and ready for service. They rejected Yahweh when they rejected Moshe as a prophet by speaking against him. Miriam and Aaron, they didn't abstain. Thus, verse 1 says, and Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moshe because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married, for he had married an Ethiopian woman. It's taught that this euphemism is repeated for her great beauty. You see, many will become leprous in the last days when they speak against Yahweh, when they speak against his anointed ones. You see, leprosy is the sign of slander, the sign of gossip. It's the sign of rejecting Yahweh's people, rejecting his commandments, and rejecting his anointing. And many people are gossiped against, slandered against. I know many people come to me and they say, oh, well, we were warned not to come here because of X, Y, and Z about you or your teachings. And you're like, wow, why didn't somebody come and speak to me about that Panaim el Panaim? I would have loved to, given my defense. And then when they come, they're like, oh, it wasn't like that at all. Because when you're tacking on that narrow path, people are going to gossip and slander against you, especially if you're going against doctrines and traditions that make people comfortable. Let's look at this final test, the 10th test of rejection, Numbers chapter 14, verse 1 through 12. The Israelites, they murmured against Moshe again. Yahweh chooses the leader who will speak for him in these last days. Verse 3 says, is it not better for us to return to Mitzrayim, Egypt? Then in verse 4, scripture says, they said one to another, let us make a leader and let us return to Mitzrayim. The spies came back with a bad report. In these last days, as we move in the Melchizedek ministry, we send out the message, and sometimes after we send that message out, we receive hostile, bad reports. We truly do. Brother Steve and Brother John will tell you. Some are more concerned with their traditions. Some are more concerned with their families than obedience to Yahweh's priesthood. Rejection of Yahweh's priesthood of Melchizedek over Levitical hierarchy or family familiarity means you don't love Yahweh, your Elohim, more than anything else that this world has to offer. And that's what it comes down to. We have to love him more than anything that this world has to offer. They rejected the promised land for fear of harm to family. This is one thing that eliminates people from going to live in the promised land. Rejection of the promised land means you reject Yahweh. Don't allow the love of family, don't allow the love of family traditions to stop you from crossing over and becoming a Hebrew in the Commonwealth of Israel. And you've almost probably experienced that this past month. And some of you experience it every Shabbat. But be admonished. We have one life. Let's make it count, because we're not going to be a people that are caught up in unbelief and rejection like the world. Verse 11 of our text, going back now to Hebrews chapter 3, verse 11. But I did want to visit those 10 tests because the Apostle Paul speaks to the Corinthians and he uses the history to speak into their very life. I believe if we can understand how these Israelites in the past tested Yahweh and unbelief and rejection came upon them, that when these same things pop up in our generation, we will remember not only this teaching, but we'll remember the word and we'll go, you know what, I'm not going back. I'm not going back for the meat. I'm not going to fall prey to the same temptations and tests that the previous generation did. Verse 11 of Hebrews chapter 3. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter into my rest. Listen, Israelite brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living Elohim. Now there's 3 types of rest. Number 1, creation rest. It speaks of a completed work and it is related to the Exodus generation. The application here is to rest in Moshiach's completed and finished work and not to return to the book of the law, Levitical temple hierarchy. Don't do that. That's what the author's trying to communicate. Number 2, there's Canaan rest, a rest from struggling with the enemy. How many of us want to enter into that Canaan rest? A rest from struggling with the enemy. Possessing. You and I need to possess new-found territory in our lives and get victory. We have got to go to war. Remember last week I said that the borders of the nations, according to the Septuagint, are defined by the heavenly angels. And some of those angels are warring principalities. And I believe this nation has been taken over by a fallen angel. I won't say any more about that. But I really could. Especially if you start digging in to what the Egyptologists were doing back around the birth of Barack Obama, when they went into the tombs and they extracted DNA from the pharaohs. Okay, won't say any more, but those of you that like to dig, good night, Josephine. What an insane world we live in. You don't believe in hybrids and what they were messing around doing back then? Huh? Oh yeah, the blue bloods. Anyway, that's another teaching. I think that might be in Torah Parsha Shemot, somewhere back there. We've covered a lot of ground the past couple of years, and you guys are still here. Warren, you don't know what you've got yourself into, mate. Oh, you do? Okay, that's why you're here, right? Okay. But the second kind of rest is the Canaan rest. It's rest from struggling with the enemy, principalities. It's about us possessing new territory together, subjecting our mind, our will, and our heart to the living Yahweh. Enables us to do what? Conquer sin and conquer the land. That's what I want in my life. I want to conquer all those areas of weakness. And the third kind of rest is Sabbath-keeping piety. It's relating to the enthronement psalms. It's a rest in spiritual maturity with a wider view of the Messianic kingdom. And Sabbath is for those that are spiritually mature. I mean, you have to admit it, because it's very easy to be spiritually immature and say, oh, well, Sabbath's whenever I decide it is. Psalm 95, which this quotes, is used in the liturgy for the inauguration of the Sabbath. So let's keep it in context. It's all about the Sabbath. In the authorized daily book of prayer for Jewish communities, it's used in that liturgy. And it's also used for the call to worship in the Book of Common Prayer in the Anglican Church. In many hymns, the Promised Land, it's a picture of this mystical heaven. You know, you sing the hymns and you're talking about the Promised Land and you're all thinking about going to heaven. No one has ascended into heaven. None. No one. But the Son of Man who has descended from heaven. That's really hard for people to understand. When you die, you go to the grave and you await the ascension. Isaiah, Daniel, the prophets, Moshe Rabbeinu, they're in the grave. Grandma's not in heaven. She's in the grave. This is tough for people, but it's really, the writer of the book of Hebrews says it's elementary. But many of us, we went to the government elementary schools and we got indoctrinated with many of their doctrines. But we find that in the hymns, Promised Land is a picture of heaven, but in Scripture, which is important, the Promised Land isn't a picture of heaven, but it's a picture of rest, ceasing to struggle with the enemy. Think about it. In Scripture, the Promised Land is about rest, ceasing to struggle with the enemy. And isn't that what we truly want? Right now, in the exile, we should be struggling with the enemy everywhere we go. And we are. It is a struggle. It is a battle if you're engaged. If you're engaged. And many of you go, man, I don't understand. I'm more devout than I've ever been. I'm in the Word more than I've ever been. And my life is harder than it's ever been. Welcome to the emunah of the saints. Right? Because when you don't compromise and you live a zealous life, all of a sudden, the girl that you thought that you wanted to marry, you realize, whoa, hang on a minute. No. And then when you start to think about, well, yeah, this is how I want to operate my business, and then you start to look at the scriptures, you're like, oh, can't do that anymore. Oh, the pediatrician that I'm going to send my children to, well, I can't send them to that guy anymore. Oh, the school down the road that I was going to, oh, I can't do that anymore. Oh, yeah, that hamburger I was going to pick off the shelf, can't eat that anymore. Oh, those sugar-free cough drops, can't have that anymore. Oh, go over here, have a glass of water. Oh, I can't have that anymore. Go to the dentist. Excuse me, embarrass myself now. You're not going to fluoridate my children. Well, of course we are. No, you're not. Everywhere I go, I'm swimming upstream and people are looking at me like, you just get used to it. I went to the dentist with my kids. Do you know what they do when I go to the dentist? They open up the blinds and they take a picture of my license plate. Because I ask funny questions and pay cash. Because I don't have Obamacare. Seriously, didn't they? They took a picture of my license plate because I wouldn't sign all the forms because I said, hey, look, I'm just paying cash. Just clean my kids' teeth. I want to get out of here. It's a crazy world. It's a crazy world. Verse 13 of Hebrews, but exhort one another daily, meaning you and I come alongside one another to help, while it is called today, lest any of you become hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we are made partakers of the Mashiach, if we hold on to the beginning of our confidence firm to the end, while it is said, today, this has got to be one of my favorite sayings in Scripture. Today, if you will hear his voice. I think that is one of my favorite verses in Scripture right there. Because that truly is my born-again life right there. And yours too. Today, if you will hear his voice. Harden not your heart as in the rebellion. For some, when they heard, did rebel. Was it not those that came out of Egypt with Moshe? Although not all of them. But with whom was he grieved for 40 years? Was it not with them that had sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? You see, Satan has the power to cause death, but he has no right. Listen, Satan, He has the power to cause death. But I want you to take comfort in this. He has no right to inflict it upon someone who resists temptation and does not sin. And to whom did he swear that they should enter into his rest? Verse 18. But to them that believe not. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. Finishing up here, you see, the death of Yeshua himself is called an exodus. An exodus. The death of Yahushua is called an exodus in Luke chapter 9, verse 31 in the Greek. Our life, our trials, our temptations, and our deliverance are foreshadowed through the Exodus account. 1 Corinthians 10 tells us that. We are the assembly. Truly today, we are the assembly in the wilderness. Today, only if you will hear his voice. Our mikveh, our baptism, our ritual immersion was foreshadowed by Israel's passage through the Red Sea. Our feeding on Messiah's flesh, well, that was foreshadowed by Israel's nourishment with the manna. And the blood, which we're supposed to drink, well, that was foreshadowed by Israel's nourishment on that water that came from the rock. Their life truly began with their exodus, and our life truly began with Yahushua's exodus, his death in Jerusalem. Just as Israel was put into a probationary period for 40 years after their exodus, our audience that the writer of the book of Hebrews is writing to, they are now living in their probationary period of 40 years. It was about 40 years after Yahushua's exodus that they were living, and they were coming to the very climatic end of their probationary period. And that was the sense of urgency. Today, if you hear his voice, because tomorrow the temple might fall down. Because they were coming to the end of their 40-year probationary period. Therefore, it was a sense of urgency that if they did not cross over with ritual immersion and come into the commonwealth of faith, then they would face the judgment which was death upon that generation. Likewise, we today, as I've said in past teachings, we are coming to the end of our 40-year probationary period since the Iranian Revolution and the fall and takeover of this United States government. We are now coming to the cataclysmic final end where this government is trying to take over other sovereign nations through terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism using ISIS, going against other nations. And we are coming towards the end of our probationary period when there is going to be a judgment upon this generation and those housed within this nation, that if we don't get our exodus right, then we will fall prey to FEMA camps and all of that which comes with it. So we have to be prepared. We have to be ready. If we can hear his voice, today is that day. Even in Qumran literature, there was an expectation of the 40 years between the death of the religious teacher and the consuming of all men of war who returned with the man of falsehood. You see, we're living, I believe, in a parallel reality to those in Kadesh Barnea. We're living in a parallel reality to the audience of the book of Hebrews, not only in light of the upcoming 40-year physical judgment upon our generation, when our government got sold out after the Iranian Revolution, which with that, you're going to get all of the Islamic pushback because of that. And that's what's happening. It's been fermented. And it is not by coincidence we have a Jesuit pope in these last days. A Jesuit pope. If you look at how the Jesuits are connected and fermenting this and have been fermenting this for centuries, we have to see that you and I are going to face intense resistance that parallels the opposition that the children of Israel faced from the inhabitants of the land. And it parallels the persecution the Hebrews audience suffered. Why? What do we have in common with the audience and the wilderness generation? You and I, we have severed our relationship with the established religious systems. The wilderness generation, they severed their relationship with the established religious systems of Egypt. The Hebrews audience, they had severed their relationship with the established Levitical hierarchy religious systems. And you and I, we have severed our relationships with the established Christian doctrine and messianic dogma and doctrines that many of you have been a part of for the past decade or so, trying to seek out the truth and realizing that just leads you back into Levitical hierarchy and Jewish genealogy chasing. You see, it really is a time where we have renounced the establishment's religions, and therefore we will incur the wrath of that religious community, sometimes just with passing conversations with friends and sometimes with foes. For me, I've experienced it from the Messianic community, and of course, before that, the traditional Calvary Chapel community that I came out of. And for you, well, all of you, you have your own stories of how you were plucked out. But our author admonishes us, believe, stay the course, and stick with Yahweh, and you will be secure. Because ultimately, he has given us the victory at Yahushua's exodus.